Hey Kyle, how's it going?
Hi, Matt.
So what does it mean to think about the environmental cost of records?
I think basically it means looking at what recordings are made out of and where the materials come from. I think it also means looking at what happens to recordings when they're disposed of.
So what do we know?
So in the early days of commercial sound recording, the most popular format in the US was the cylinder, which was played on something called a phonograph. And at first, cylinders were made out of wax-like substances that were made from animal fats, like something called beef tallow, as well as processed paraffin waxes, like the coal-based stench wax.
So beef tallow, we're talking animal products.
We're talking animal fat.
Gross.
Yep. Non-vegetarian.
So what about 78 discs? I mean, they were made of shellac, right? What is shellac anyway?
So that story actually begins with the beetles. In this case, the lac beetles in India, which, as part of their mating process, cover trees in lac resin a couple times a year. So the beetles die in this process, and they leave their eggs and the lac resin stuck to the trees. The lac is then harvested and taken to processing facilities in places like Calcutta, where it gets get washed and dried and melted and processed in various ways. And then that processed lac was packed up into burlap sacks and shipped by boat to the USA.
Okay, so what happens once they're inside the factory?
Inside the factory, the various ingredients for shellac discs are combined, and so those ingredients, of course, include shellac. But shellac is actually a small minority component of the shellac discs. These discs are actually mostly made of filler, which consisted mainly of limestone and slate, crushed rock, which came mainly from quarries in the United States. And then mixed all of these ingredients and melted it all down and pressed them into discs.
So shellac discs don't actually contain a whole lot of shellac at all. So what about vinyl?
Well, vinyl marks the beginning of the plastic era for music production. And to make vinyl, first crude oil has to be extracted from the ground. It's then put into barrels and shipped by boat to places like Bangkok in Thailand. And this is where up to 90% of the polyvinyl chloride, or PVC plastic, used to make records is processed today. And vinyl records are made of trace amounts of all kinds of different chemicals, but the main ingredients are PVC and a copolymer of PVC and something called polyvinyl acetate.
So we're getting into chemicals now which sound like they are definitely not natural.
Well, it's certainly not an environmentally friendly process. I mean, cancer-causing chemicals get leached into the surrounding ground and water supplies, and the factory workers can develop health problems from handling the stuff. It gets turned into little pellets, packed into big boxes that weigh as much as a ton, and shipped by boat to places like Long Beach, California, where this raw material is then distributed to record pressing plants all across the country.
So are things any better with cassettes or CDs?
Well, cassettes and CDs are also both made of plastic, basically. When we look at the wider trend of plastic consumption in the recording industry here, an interesting picture emerges. In 1977, when vinyl peaked, the industry consumed over 41 million kilograms of plastic. In 1988, which is the peak of cassettes, that amount was 35 million kilograms. And then, in the year 2000, which was the peak of the CD, that amount had actually grown. And CDs are much smaller than cassettes, but the amount actually grew to roughly 54 million kilograms of plastic. So smaller formats, using less plastic per format, were actually offset by increases in overall sales.
So that just means that even though these formats are getting smaller, people are buying more and more units. Vinyl, CDs, cassettes, they've got their problems, but smartphones, now we're living in utopia, the future, right? Because they're really tiny and you can put all of your music on them, so that must be good, right?
Again, you might think that.
Oh, Kyle!
I'm so sorry. But if you actually look at an iPhone, just as one example, it's made of lots of materials that are really costly to extract, and costly not just in economic terms, but in human terms and environmental terms. So think about aluminum, sapphire, glass, cobalt, gold, copper, silver, silicon, nickel, tin, neodymium. So that's a lot of different stuff. And a lot of that is mined and processed and assembled in places like South America, Africa, and Asia, and often not according to very fair or ethical practices for workers. Also, devices like iPhones quickly become obsolete, which leads to problems of electronic waste, or sometimes called e-waste. The services that we use to listen to music online use loads of energy. But the internet is actually made up of a huge infrastructure of servers, underground and overground and undersea cables, and then most of the electricity used to run services like Spotify, to take just one streaming example, is actually generated by burning uranium, coal, and gas. So on the one hand, when downloading and streaming take over in terms of music sales, the amount of plastics used actually drops drastically, which we would expect. And it's what makes it seem like the rise of downloading and streaming are making music more environmentally friendly. But actually a different picture emerges when we think about the electricity used to power online music. So what we have to do here is convert the plastics that we use into greenhouse gas emissions, which are sometimes also known as carbon dioxide or CO2 equivalents. And what we see then is that CO2 equivalents remain relatively constant over the peak years of all the previous formats. And this is where things get really interesting, is that even our most conservative estimates of the CO2 equivalents released from music recording actually shows an increase when we get to streaming. And a more pessimistic estimate actually shows that the amounts could be much higher.
But these figures seem like they're really difficult to calculate, so what if those figures are wrong?
It's really, really difficult to estimate, how much electricity it uses per Google search or per stream and things like that. So the variation between the conservative and pessimistic estimates are an indication that it's almost impossible to calculate how much energy is used by the internet in general, let alone music streaming in particular, and especially with good accuracy. There's simply too many variables. But I think we can say one thing for sure, which is that storing and processing music online uses a tremendous amount of resources and energy.
So what we've concluded is we have very little idea about what the most responsible way is in which to consume music.
I think it's a very difficult question.
Well, we gave it a try.
We've done our best.